Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today's guest will be a familiar name to many people. It's Russell Webster, who was born and bred in Coventry, and with a degree of modern languages behind him, Russell has spent 10 years working in the social care field. He qualified as a probation officer in 1987, working with offenders in North and East London, and he's also worked for a range of voluntary sector organisations in both this country and the USA. Russell developed his consultancy skills through work with two national voluntary organisations before going freelance in 1996, and he's been a full-time researcher and consultant ever since. And I think perhaps you're best known for your writing, your blog summary of whatever's happening in the criminal justice system, which is circulated very widely. Although the work always varies, it mainly comprises research for various government departments, needs assessments for local commissioners, and evaluation work with community organisations. Really pleased to have you join us today, Russell. Welcome.
Thanks ever so much. Nice to be here.
Hi Russell, very nice to meet you. Thanks a lot for coming along today. So you originally worked as a probation officer, as I understand it, and I'm interested to hear a bit about that, where you worked and how you got into that particular field of work.
Well, I've never been 100% clear. I'm no clearer today than I was then about how I ended up in probation. I know that as a young man I was kind of quite passionate about things, quite kind of political, and I know I wanted to make a difference. I know I didn't. I was convinced that I was going to get on the fast-track prisoner governor course, and I wrote an application which I'm sure would make me hell with laughter if I read it back today. I think my main motivation was I wanted to do something with my life and not be involved in the production of Mars bars. It doesn't make any more sense now than it did then. But I think I did have, a passion about kind of injustice and people having an equal kind of chance in life. And for some reason, the law never crossed my mind, and working with people it interested me. I think if I'm more honest, which obviously hindsight and being older allows you to be, I think there was what I might now think of a slight vicarious pleasure of interest in other people's lives and wanting to kind of know, what went on. But yes, I mean, to be honest, it was such a straightforward process in those days. I got a degree. I found a job working with young adults in the criminal justice system. I applied to do the probation officer training, which new recruits will be horrified to know consisted of 2 years, a combined MA, very kind of extensive, very well supervised placements, and all with a tiny salary. So we were, looking back, we're certainly the generation that were very lucky. I have an ordinary degree and a master's, and I didn't pay a penny towards either of them, and just wish my children could have had the same opportunities.
Yeah, here to that. So I've worked in London as well, in North Kensington and in Homerton, and when I went to work in Homerton, the people I worked with kept referring to Murder Mile. Well, Murder Mile seemed to shift around a bit, but nevertheless, it must have been a fairly difficult place for you to be working as a probation officer.
I guess so. I mean, I do remember it, I suppose like all these things, like you pass your driving test and you're excited, then you get in the car and you're on your own and you think, oh my God, what have I done? So when I walked into the office for my first day, interestingly, my manager didn't speak to me for 4 days because he was sulking with the rest of the team. I had 10 cases, 2 of whom were people who were rapists in prison. And I think it certainly kind of struck home then, what I'd let myself in for. And and I suppose the responsibility of the job, which obviously you felt you knew after 2 years, but actually kind of winging it, or as it, I suppose it feels to everyone on their first day in the job, was a scary prospect.
So why did you end up leaving the profession, Russell?
Well, that's a much easier question to answer, David. I wasn't much cop as a probation officer. I really enjoyed the job. I enjoyed working with people on probation. I enjoyed working with my colleagues. Yeah, so I was passionate about the job. I enjoyed it. I think I was quite good at engaging with people. I was good at advocating for people. It was a long time ago, so actually it was really possible to find people housing, to find them resources to furnish a flat or help if they recently had a child, etc. What I wasn't very good at was the actual core of the job, which was helping people make sense of their lives and sort out the kind of the chaos, confusion, and make a good plan going forward. So I was forever making successful applications to get people into rehab and being really disappointed when they left 6 days later. And it took really I had a kind of belated gap year in my late 20s. I went and worked in the States for a year. Completely unplanned. I think the trigger was a relationship kind of breakup. I'm going to do something different with my life. And again, when I remember being on the plane thinking, what have I done now? But really, obviously, working in a different culture gives you a different perspective. And again, I learnt loads, had a fantastic time, but that job was also very difficult for me. And I just thought, I realised, you know, with the advantages of some distance, do you know what? You know, you've got other skills, but this kind of core key work with people isn't one of them. So I came back and changed direction.
So what was the job in the States that you went to?
It was working in Pittsburgh in a project that was essentially the last 6 to 9 months for children in care. So social workers have suddenly realised, oh, you'll be an adult next year. And so the residential place I worked for really was focused on helping people get the life skills to be independent. And that was a very mixed and scary environment. And I had a fantastic boss who had 27 ways of doing anything. If I could have learned just by osmosis to be as talented as he was at working with troubled young people, I would have been very happy to stay in that role. He was fabulous and a great raconteur as well. And you know, I suppose again it's funny, isn't it, how easy it is to bond with people from different cultures. So he was couldn't have had a more different upbringing from me. He was an African American guy working 2 or 3 jobs, as most of my colleagues did it in the States. Tremendously successful, but had to kind of prove himself kind of repeatedly. But I'd watch him de-escalate young people that were getting terribly upset, and I've also seen him use a completely different technique equally successfully, actually acting slightly more crazy than they were when he realised that they weren't actually out of control, but had got used to a pattern of kind of presenting that behaviour because it was successful for them. So I have loads of wonderful memories of Irwin and the things I learned, and the long discussions we'd have if we were going out in the car together, perhaps to interview and assess a young person who was thinking of joining the programme.
It's really interesting, well, refreshing actually, to hear you say, well, I loved the job, but I just wasn't that good at this core part, because I think so often people aren't brave enough to appraise their skills in that way. So people trundle on for years, don't they, perhaps not being terribly efficient at whatever role they've taken, and yet you've taken the skills that you did have and were really good at to do something really creative and innovative, but very much tied still to the criminal justice system. And how nice it would be if everyone was able to be that honest with themselves about the things that they're good at and the things that they're not so good at.
Yeah, I guess so. But obviously, I don't think there's a worse feeling in the world than doing a job that you're not doing very well. I think most of us experience in life when we start. But if you don't grow into the role and have that confidence, then it's just miserable for yourself, your loved ones, and it's not very good for the people that you're working with.
Well, yes, I mean, you were doing very challenging work in really quite tough conditions, both in North and East London and in, did you say it was Pittsburgh? Yeah, so I think what you did demonstrate was extraordinary capacity to learn and pick up things, and allied with this capacity that Naomi referred to for self-reflection and understanding oneself.
Well, I guess that's a kind of your value as a consultant is as an outsider that can come fresh to something, and obviously I knew by the time I went to the States, I understood the British criminal justice, the English and Welsh criminal justice system well, but then seeing how different the States was a double bonus, really, because it obviously, A, it was fascinating, but B, it shone a new light on our system from a different perspective. But I might indulge in one anecdote, if I may. So we had a young woman in our care who was very close to 18, who had learning difficulties, and it became quite clear that she was being groomed and getting into a very, very vulnerable situation. Now, had I been back home, we'd done everything we could. We'd reported her missing. She basically left the unit. We didn't know where she was. But as you know, the States is a more proactive and assertive kind of approach to things. So for 2 or 3 weeks, myself and my colleagues drove around in the areas that we knew we frequented. And in retrospect, I guess we kidnapped her off the streets. We drove her to the local juvenile institution, which would have got me sacked back home. She was taken into custody. We got her out in front of the judge the next day. The judge said she'd been behaving terribly and was sentencing her to 3 months, which left us traumatised. They took her downstairs, from the dock, at which point the judge turned to us and said, well, I do think she needed a good scare. Now I'm going to get her back up now and tell her that you've convinced me to give her one last chance. And it's just unimaginable in a British setting. But certainly that power of, well, we're not just going to stand by and watch this happen and wring our hands and say, oh no, I'm afraid we can't do anything about it because we're not allowed. I'm not saying there aren't dangers to that approach, but it was wonderful to feel to have made a difference. And I kind of left, a few months later, but I don't know what became of her, but her life was better at that point than it had been, months previously. But yeah, it really had my brain spinning kind of in that courtroom, going through that gamut of emotions. Can't imagine a sentencer in a English youth court doing that kind of double take, kind of almost like a reality show. It would feel like over here.
That's a great story, Russell. So you're wondering really whether it was that kind of entrepreneurial spirit that you encountered in the US, which then encouraged you to leave employment and go it alone.
Well, I think it did. I didn't do that straight away when I came back. I actually found a couple of jobs with the voluntary sector that were kind of policy and practice development jobs. And if I'm honest, if you'd asked me 2 months before I went freelance if I've ever worked for myself, I would say, oh, no way. Because actually my my mum and dad, when they got to about 40, it had always been a dream of theirs to own their own business, and they took on a B&B, a guest house, and I had seen them work all day, every day, with hardly any kind of holidays, and they were very keen for me to take over the business, and I was horrified at the prospect. So as always, it's not a plan, it's life that happens. So I had enjoyed the work that I'd done for these two voluntary sector organisations. Needless to say, they kept losing funding, and I knew that the second organisation I was working for was struggling with funding and was much too nice. My boss, who had become a personal friend, would have only let me go as a last resort. And I said, well, do you know what? Why don't I go? I'm just started this project. Why don't you let me do that project under your name, but paid for me? And I had one other contact for a couple of days, work a week for alcohol concern, as it was then, for a couple of months. And I'm still amazed at myself that I took the risk, but I did, and you know, that's 1996, so it kind of seems to have worked out.
So you left this charitable organisation, was it? And that's how you got into your own business startup. How did that go? I was just because you seem to be describing a sort of segue from working within that small charitable organisation into starting your own business. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, well, it was a very different experience, obviously. And I guess, go on.
So it must have been. I'm thinking it must have been, very stressful for you. You'd seen what your parents had done and how hard they had to work. How did you cope with the stress and uncertainty?
Well, I guess it's, as all these things, it was exciting, and it was, I think it was a fit for me. I suppose I had worked for about 10 years in proper jobs with employers, and if you got all my managers from those different roles in the same room, they'd have all said, yes, Russell, he's very passionate, he's very hard-working, and he's a right pain in the arse. One of my favourite managers, who had a gift for words, wrote in my annual appraisal, could allow himself to be managed more. So there was a lot of arrogance in that young man, and if you said I should do it like this, I was quite happy to if I agreed, but if I didn't, I would do it the way I thought I should do it. So in a way, having that control over how I went about things was obviously suited my personality. I mean, I think probably the same with most ways of earning a living, massive advantages and massive disadvantages, and they're obviously typically the opposite sides of the same coin. So being a freelancer has been brilliant when my children were young. Never missed a sports day, never missed a school play. My grown-up daughter went in her last month at last term at uni, had a very, very serious traumatic brain injury, which was in a coma for a long period of time. And I was able to be with her 3 or 4 days a week for the first 4 or 5 years and work around that. And although that was obviously a stressful, horrible time, mainly because of what had happened to our girl, I couldn't have done that if I'd had a proper job. My other half, who cared equally much, had a sympathetic employer, but after a month, it's not so. She ended up doing more evenings, and I ended up doing the daytimes, and I think we're both convinced that my daughter still will always have big challenges that she's got a quality of life she'd never have had we not been able to be with her. So that's priceless. The flip side of it is that I think I have really missed being part of a team. You know, many of my best friends over the years I've met in work settings, and essentially you meet lots of people you really like, but normally they're the client. So there is a difference there, and you don't go out for a coffee at lunchtime or a drink after work or whatever. And you do get anxious about having enough work. I think any freelancer in any field will tell you there's only two amounts of work, and that is feast and famine, flood and drought. You know, there's so much work you don't know how you could possibly get it done. It's also stressful and you bore on to everyone. Or, oh my God, where's the next piece coming from? How will I be able to pay the bills? And people say, yeah, what do you mean? You were complaining you had too much on last time I saw you. And of course the two go together, because you feel like you can't say no, so you spend all your time doing the work, and then there is a natural rhythm to all these things, which means that projects tend to end up ending together. And then you have, because you've been working so hard, you haven't been looking for new work, and you have the panic. And I wouldn't say the panic's gone at my age, but I have a bit more faith it'll probably be all right.
But it certainly sounds that there were aspects of going freelance which you found liberating and essential for your life circumstance at that time.
Yes, I've been very lucky. I've been very lucky.
Thank you.
So Russell, since you've left, you've managed to build up a reputation as a sort of criminal justice influencer, with communication playing a huge part in what you do. Was communication something that came naturally to you?
Well, kind of yes and no, Naomi. I mean, I do like a party, but I'm not the person talking to everyone in the party. Actually, I'm really comfy writing, and I think writing is my main skill, and really what's enabled me to make a living as a consultant, because a lot of people that have very many skills that I don't have get that kind of school, university anxiety, blank sheet of paper. But when you write reports for a living, which kind of in a way I do, I don't. I have a little wriggle for an hour. I like to, get the template set up so it looks nice. I can't do, but I don't waste time looking at that. And I'm much more comfortable really behind the written world. I do, as I've become known, I get lots of requests. I've got I think the term being pursued might be a bit strong, but I had, there'll be a big kind of national programme, which will probably be out before you, before you kind of publish this, on the state of the probation service, and they really wanted me to be the kind of expert talking head, and I had to say, no, I'm really happy to talk about context. I really don't want to be there, to do that. And so I wouldn't say I'm an influencer at all. What I think I have got quite good at, and something that I really enjoy, is the kind of networking and connecting people. So I get lots of requests via the blog, do you know this, do you know that? And people mistake the online presence, because what I really do is share other people's work on the blog. People make an assumption that I know everything about the criminal justice system, and of course I don't. But increasingly over the years, I know lots of people that do know about this issue, that group of people, etc. And it's a kind of pleasure to put people in contact with each other and say, no, I don't know, but I'm really happy to contact someone I know, and if they're agreeable, I'll put you in touch. And I think certainly that academic community, people that read the blog are passionate about their work, be they academics, be they practitioners. So people that do care about their job, it is their motivation, they do get a lot of their fulfillment from work, tend to be happy to speak to other people with the same passion. So it's not hard to do, and it's a bit of a pleasure to do.
But I'm kind of getting the sense that you're a humble sort of person who's perhaps a little bit overly modest, actually, Russell, because you've also completed over 100 evaluations of pilot projects. You know, so you've made your own contribution beyond circulating other people's work. And you know, had you done much research before you became a freelancer?
No, no, and I was very lucky. I did one piece of research with a kind of proper researcher who's become a lifelong friend, who's been a professor of criminology for many years, Paul Turnbull, and he had, you know, he understood all the methodology and how to go about it, and I had the subject knowledge, and we worked well together. And funnily enough, it was an evaluation of the first arrest referral scheme in the country, which would have been almost 30 years ago, and consisted of really one man, one woman, one dog, and has now, almost 30 years later, turned into Change, Grow, Live, the largest drug and alcohol treatment agency in the country, with a budget of somewhere between £1 and £200 million a year. So it's kind of, it's always funny to kind of look at that, how the world has changed during our working kind of careers. But I learnt lots from Paul, and I guess, like most of us, you learn. So I could write, I could analyse, I could do really basic data analysis. I was interested, I wanted to make a difference. And then over time you learn skills and you work with other people that have better skills in certain areas than yourself. I did the most interesting thing, I think, that I'm going to do this year is a big study of what happened to almost everyone that's been released on parole in this country in the last 10 years. Now, the data analysis on that scale is way beyond my capabilities, but I have, a colleague, Tim McSweeney, that I've worked with many times, and I know, if ever I have a quantitative problem, I just email or pick up the phone and say, Tim, does this really mean that? And he goes, no, Russell, actually it means this, and that really is, if you do it long enough, I think you get to the happy stage where, although I wouldn't say I have control over what work I get, probably more than half the work I do, I work with people that I trust, know have different skill sets to me, that have the same kind of outlook on life. There's lots of public commissioners or university departments I've worked with or for that send out a 20-30 page contract at the start of anything. I've never read any of those apart from the page that says this is actually what the project is, and I'm just really happy to work on the human relationship and sign it and send it back. So, well, I know you're going to pay me, and yeah, of course I'm not going to talk to anyone, it belongs to you, it's your work, that's that. And it's very refreshing, I think, to work with people you trust like that. And I find that, although you might think, well, it just makes you complacent, actually when you work with people you really trust, that we tend to kind of push each other more and say, well, why are you doing that? You said you were going to do this, why did I? And it makes you articulate and justify and sometimes reverse your decisions or change your decisions in a way that it's harder, I think. Again, when you work in a team where you know each other in a place of work, then obviously positive teams work in that way all the while. But when you're a freelancer, it's quite precious to have those relationships.
What are the kind of projects you feel most interested in, you get most drawn to? Is there a central theme? Because criminal justice is a really broad area, isn't it?
It is, and I suppose It's good of me that always says whatever I'm working on at the time, because that's what you're kind of enthusiastic about. Um, and as an evaluator, you do find what you find. And I've certainly evaluated the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I'll be absolutely lying if I didn't say it's much more satisfying to evaluate something that's really kind of positive. Um, and sometimes they are big national programs. Actually, my favourite piece of work for last 5 or 6 years has been the evaluation of a small charity called Fine Cell Work that actually teaches men in prison how to stitch, how to embroider and do tapestry, etc. Pays them for their time. The quality of the stuff they produce is amazing and gets sold at high-end kind of outlets. And it has been an ongoing treat to evaluate that. In fact, that's where I was yesterday. So the difference it makes to people in terms of just surviving that prison experience. And I think if you told a younger me, or I'd stop people in the street and say, do you know what, there's this really good scheme teaching people inside how to stitch. Your first instinct would be to laugh. But actually, there's something about creating something from scratch. There's pride in that achievement. The quality of the work, as I said, is amazing. People find it very therapeutic. They find a connection to the outside world. Even though they're paid very small amounts of money, they're working for a charity and they feel good about that. And it's a project I've reflected most about and talked most about. It's probably one of the smallest jobs I've ever done, although I do a little bit for them every year. But I think just those profound things that make life happy for human beings, the sense of how much you feel better when you've achieved something in the day, when it's purposeful, when it's real, even more so when it's beautiful in this case. And I've been amazed at how many people can do it, because I instinctively feel I would definitely be useless at it. And I have spoken to people with quite a long way down the kind of ADHD scale, who I've asked a 6-word question and they've not been able to answer it because their brain has fired off in other directions. And yet in front of them is a piece of work that has perhaps taken them 60, 80, 140 hours, requiring total focus. When it goes wrong, it has to be unpicked and done again. And it's a marvel to me that I suppose that's one of the great things that we know there are so many arts and activities that come out of people when they have those constraints put on them, that they're forced and actually have the time and sometimes the opportunity, and you realise there is so much talent in so many of us, and so few of us get to kind of realise it. Anyway, I didn't think I'd talk about that for 10
No,
minutes.
that's a really nice story, and also I think it must be really nice to be in a position where you can actually highlight those kind of pockets of good practice, because in some ways the more attention that goes to them makes the chance of them continuing a little bit more certain, doesn't it? And things can be quite vulnerable to having funding pulled or not being able to continue. So I think if you're doing something that contributes to establishing it as useful or giving it visibility,
people find it a big help with their mental health. It's a kind of meditative activity.
Where do you draw your inspiration for your writing for the blog from? Is that just something that randomly pokes out for you that week, or?
Well, that's part of today's theme, I suppose. So, yes, no plans to do it. I've been pottering along freelance for about 10 or 12 years, very happily, in a very small specialist field. And the way it worked was that you tendered for bits of work, and because it was small and specialised, and because I was okay at it, I kind of normally, sort of 6-7 times out of 10, I'd get the tender, and that was my work for the year. Then 2008 and the financial meltdown happened, and lots of things kind of coalesced. So I'd be bidding for quite a small bit of work, but 2 months' work for me, so really significant. And I suddenly found out I was going up against KPMG, who knew nothing about the subject and were clearly going to put 2 interns on it. So my kind of success rate dipped. At the same time, inevitably, I think in any form of work, you form relationships with people. So I'd done a number of bits of work for the same organisation that was happy. And I remember them, one client, it was a drug and alcohol action team in one of the London boroughs, calling me up and saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry, Russell, but you know, we agreed that bit of work, which in this case was about 6 months' work for me. I'm afraid we can't give it you." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" And they said, "Well, because our procurement people said you can't use Russell again because you used him last year." So suddenly I realised I was in a situation where the options were get a real job, which would have been by that point, if I was difficult to manage before 10 years freelance, would have been disastrous all round, or try and get my work in other ways. And that's really where the blog came from. And it started off, you know, once or twice a week, and then became much more kind of regular. And I don't really have any illusions about it. I think it's just putting together in one place the latest developments for very busy people. And I think people look at the daily email and think, "Oh, not interested," or, "Well, bit interested, I'll save that and read the summary later." And then every week, month, 3 months for different people, I'd cover something that was bang in their area of interest, or something that they were doing at the moment, and then they would click on the substantive report that I was summarising, and it was really valuable to people. And so just gradually, over time, it grew organically. And it is how I get my work now, really. People ring me up and saying, "Oh, I wondered, would you?" I said, "Oh, yes, I'd be interested. Tell me more."
Again, there's that humility there, because I was at a conference last year where criminologists were pondering over how do we make our work more accessible, increase our reach, and yet that's something that you're actually doing really well. And I think that's part of the problem for academics, isn't it? You know, that they're writing, and practitioners sometimes, that they're writing stuff and it's going into professional journals, but actually there's something about making it more accessible so that ordinary people can also read and digest it, and that allows something to take off, I think.
I mean, to be honest, that's something I've actually set out to try and do, to cover lots of research in the blog over the last 2 or 3 years, mainly because the state of our criminal justice system is pretty awful at the moment. And when you cover the latest policy, stats, etc., I'm starting to feel bad, you know. There's thousands of people go to work every day, try and make a difference. And then there's this steady diet of, "Well, that's rubbish, that's got worse. Oh, you know, this has gone wrong," etc. So I was really actively looking, without kind of misrepresenting the realities, you know, for good practice, for the things that people were doing. And an easy way of doing that was to reach out to researchers that were doing interesting work and say, "I saw your 28-page piece in the, but could you write me 600 words in plain non-academic English," which some academics do wonderfully and others find very hard to do. Because essentially they are academics are mainly talking to other academics, but their interest, the interest obviously in the findings, is to practitioners in particular. And that's been again a real kind of pleasure to do. There are lots of kind of really good hidden forums and that people tell me about, and then I can tell others about, and it's just one of those win-wins all round, really. You know, it's great for me to share interesting, good quality content, and obviously encourages other people to, you know, to get in touch and say, "Oh, I'm just doing this, would you be interested?"
Thank you, Russell. You've had such a variety of work since you stopped being a probation officer, and you've clearly been very creative in how you approach the tasks that you take on. Do you think there's anything that statutory services could do to enable this kind of creativity to be deployed within the more traditional roles?
Well, I do. When I was a probation officer, which is obviously a very long time ago, there was a lot less bureaucracy and a lot more encouragement. I remember working with a colleague who again became a kind of a close personal friend, who was passionate about the racial disparity that applied to a lot of the young black men on our caseload. And so we decided we should do something about it. So within 4 weeks, we said to our senior, our boss, oh, look, we're really worried about these bunch of young people. Could we get them out on a week's pre-release and do a bunch of work with them, you know, around their offending, but also the resources they'll need, helping them, giving them a little bit of time with family before being released, giving them the chance to go and talk to employers, etc. Oh yeah, if you want to, you know, you'll have to make your work up. All right. Yeah, oh, you know, so Angela called up here, can we have that space for the week? Yeah. I contacted the prisoners. Oh yeah, you're his probation officer. Yeah, you can come out for a week to do that. And that was it. That would be a 15-month endeavour now. And although the probation service has been badly beaten up in recent years, and it wasn't as perfect as we like to pretend before the kind of privatisation and reprivatisation. However, there were very many probation officers, probation areas doing lots of really kind of positive stuff. And that really was because they had a local identity. Obviously they had to meet a set of national criteria, but they had the freedom, you know, to go and do things differently, to make partnerships, to set up new resources. And obviously, if you're passionate about your job and someone says, yeah, go on then, make a difference. If you think you can do better, we'll back you. But people respond to that. There's massive job satisfaction. And when you look at where we are now, with a more and more centralised system, less and less autonomy, less control, I mean, it's no surprise. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? In this country, we talk a lot about, oh, the private sector does this, that and the other, and yet we refuse to follow those kind of proven models of the really successful private sector businesses in terms of valuing staff. You know, it's not difficult, is it? Well, it is very difficult, but the principles aren't difficult. Recruit good staff, support them, hold them to account a little bit, and encourage them to come up with their own solutions because they know best. They're dealing with the real world every day. They can see what's changing. If something isn't working, if there's a new drug that people are starting to use, if there's a new form of grooming young people, well, who knows first? Yeah? And so, interestingly, over the last 5 years, we are starting very belatedly to value the lived experience of people in contact with the criminal justice system, which I think has had many, many benefits. But at the same time, certainly, I think we have devalued, and I don't think the two are connected at all, but we have devalued our staff working in the statutory sector. And it's funny, isn't it, really, because you would feel that those things would naturally go together.
We've just got one last question for you, Russell, really. Thinking about, you know, what advice would you give to anyone listening who might be setting themselves up as a freelance consultant? You know, you've got 30 years experience of that. So what would you offer?
Well, I did actually make some notes for this question. And I've kind of split it into two things. So there are practical things, and I have had this conversation with people over the years. And then there's kind of psychological looking after yourself things. So the kind of practical bits, I think, are straightforward. I mean, actually modern work life makes it more possible. Because I think if you've got a good idea, lots of people have split careers. If you've got an idea, pursue it, go for it, ask your boss, can I work 4 days a week? Can I work my 5 days over 4 days a week? You know, see how it goes, test it out, and then you can gradually move over it if it works out. I would say that finding good partners, people that know that have different skill sets or complementary skill sets with you is really important. I also think it's really important to kind of do what you know, do what you're good at, but kind of stretch yourself. The perfect project for me is something I know about, but in a setting I don't know about, or kind of vice versa. So I feel really confident about half of it, but I learn lots from the difference. And it's interesting, I have done, although almost, I suppose, 50% of my work has been around criminal justice and 30% around kind of drugs and alcohol. I have done different things, even some commercial things sometimes. I did an interesting project recently that was encouraging people from diverse backgrounds into the kind of creative arts, because that's an area where actually getting in is who you know. And because, even though we might feel that it's quite a diverse cast of characters in front of the screen, actually behind the screen it's very kind of wide, it's very middle class. Because who's got those connections? Well, you know, your mum, dad, your uncle, your aunt, etc. And doing the work and talking to people, I realised that though the terminology was very different, we were talking about referral routes, assessments, different ways of doing things. And I felt I had lots to kind of contribute, which I certainly wouldn't have felt 15 years later. I would have said, oh, I know nothing about that area. And I think networking is obviously important, finding people you trust, finding people whose opinion you trust. If you've got a new idea that you think is brilliant, you need someone you like and respect to test that and encourage them to say, yeah, that's great, but, or no, that's rubbish, or yeah, it's great, but unfortunately they've already doing it and they have been doing it for quite a long while. The only other thing I think I've learned practically is, and this is partly about my personality as well, in my early years I did quite a lot of training, developing kind of training and running it, and I really enjoyed it. It's something I've done a bit at those kind of proper jobs beforehand. But what I found was I loved devising the course and running it. I loved refining the course in the light of that and delivering it the second time. And when I delivered it the third time, I'm like, no, I'm not sure I'm learning much here. And actually, economically, at that time, I could have run those courses all over the country, you know, had a steady stream of income, but it didn't work for me. And one of the things I have learned over the years is that everything changes. So although it's really tempting to sign, the only time I've turned a piece of work down, it was actually a year's work, very well paid, but that's all I could have done for the year. And I knew at the end of the year that would end, and then what would happen to all my other interests and clients, etc. Anyway, that's the practical stuff. I think the kind of personal stuff is trickier, and much easier to identify in hindsight than when you're kind of doing it. Because when you do it, you're anxious, you want to make it work, you put body and soul into it. But I would really recommend holding on to your friends, holding on to a social life. If you're in a relationship, be aware that if only one of you is freelance, you will end up with all the domestic tasks, all the childcare, etc. points, because you're more flexible and amenable to do it. Don't do it if, to be honest, when I started there wasn't the internet, so actually it was great, because I really remember the first week, the first 2 months, but by Wednesday lunchtime of every week I thought, well, I've done a week's work, because I'd literally got through what I would have done in a work setting by then. And some of that is obviously the energy of a new start, and some of it is that I just wasn't wasting time. And in those days, without lots of other responsibilities and without the internet, that'd be great. So I don't have to sit here looking at the clock waiting for it to get to 5 o'clock. I can go out, I can do this, I can do that, I can do the other. So really try and cling on to that and make time for yourself to do those things, and embrace the advantages of being your own boss. And like I say, for me, certainly, and I know for freelance colleagues, that ability that you can really go to all those school plays, and all you say when someone wants to put an appointment in that day, say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I can't do that," because you are the boss. You can, and that's invaluable, and obviously stuff you can't get back. If you've missed it, you've kind of missed it. I think work in partnership wherever you can, work with people you like. Increasingly, I do stuff with people that I like and respect, and it just makes life so much less strict, less stressful. And the last thing that has taken me 29 years to learn, and I've only done the last 6 months, and I think probably something that lots of people identify with, especially kind of post-COVID, is I just used to work whenever. Now, it's brilliant when you haven't got enough time or you've got other important things to do in the day, but it's a terrible habit. And only the last 6 months have I literally switched off the computer at 5 o'clock and sometimes at 4:30. And I don't switch it on over the weekend. And for the previous 4 or 5 years, it was never off. It was off if it was rebooted. And, I might come in to Google the weather and end up seeing an email and replying. But don't do that to yourself, because your brain's always on, you don't sleep, etc. And it's really obvious, and everyone says it, but I think as a freelancer, it's very tempting to get into that. Oh, I'll just respond. Because it's off your head then. But the flip of that is that you're always looking and checking for the next. Oh, they haven't got back to me.
Russell, thank you for that conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope it's of interest to people. I haven't got the foggiest from this perspective, obviously.
Well, a lot of really interesting stuff there, Russ, and I particularly love your suggestion that one should avoid doing things repeatedly. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much.